Closing the Gap, 50 Years Seeking Equal Pay is made possible by the Eden Hall Foundation seeks to improve the quality of life in Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania. Through the lens of women's issues, it continues the stewardship of Sebastian Mueller in the areas of human services, health, education, and the arts. And by Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania has empowered women for 145 years, advancing women's causes with their Centers for Women in Politics, Entrepreneurship, and the new Chatham University Women's Institute opening in 2015. And these additional donors: Kathy Raphael, Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney, PC, Georgia Berner, MSA, and the Women and Girls Foundation.
And welcome to this special presentation of Closing the Gap, Know Your Legal Rights, Ending Gender Pay Discrimination. I'm your host, Lisa Washington. Today's program is all about recognizing gender discrimination in the workplace and learning about the resources available to fight it. We want you to be part of this conversation too, so send us your questions and comments. Our social media team is standing by and they'll get your questions to our experts who are here in the studio. I am very happy to welcome our guests, both of whom practice employment law. First, we have Samuel J. Cordes of Samuel J. Cordes & Associates, and we also welcome Edward J. Feinstein of Feinstein, Doyle, Payne & Crevice. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. When we talk about gender discrimination in the workplace, many people think we're only talking about the fight for equal pay for equal work. But what are some of the other ways that gender discrimination affects a woman's pay and her job security?
Well, it can affect a lot of different areas, including her ability to be promoted, her ability to be hired, even in the first instance. Disciplinary matters people can be treated differently because of their gender. The need for taking time off for when there's a pregnancy issue or when there's a sick child issue even. Those are sort of the major issues that happen, and it's just a matter of opportunities. I mean, equal opportunities in the workplace is more than a gender issue. It's about who we are as a society.
And Ed, when we talk about women who are being denied equal pay for equal work, for a legal purpose, how is equal work defined?
Well, to define it, what we do is look at the position, and you look at the effort that's required in a position, the skill, the education requirements, the supervisory responsibilities of the job, and you look to see whether that job is equal to another job.
And what about being equally qualified? Gender discrimination can certainly take the form of an employer who may hire a male worker over a female worker who is equally qualified. How do we define equally qualified?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. There's subjective criteria, which are very hard to measure, and then there's objective criteria. If two people have the same education, the same background, the same job performance in the instance of a promotion, that's the objective ways are the ways you start. It becomes difficult in these kinds of cases when there's higher level jobs, often has a subjective component to it. Those are the hardest cases to prove, but they're the ones that oftentimes that's where the discrimination lies, because it's in people's minds sometimes.
And you mentioned it being hard to prove. Ed, what sort of evidence does a woman need to bring forward a case like this?
Well, again, you're going to have to look at one of the things that I like to look at are job analyses. Some companies do job analyses, as well as they'll do job descriptions when they're looking to hire, or they keep them around in one's record. So if you can get a hold of those job descriptions and job analyses, you have a good idea of the basics of what each job requires, and then from there you can get either anecdotal evidence, or if you're lucky enough to somehow get evaluations, all of those things can be evidence.
Well, what should the woman do? Should she go to seek out a lawyer first, or should she go to human resources at her company?
That's a very that's a great question, and you know, sometimes we're wrong on that. But you know, you might want to try human resources first in a non-confrontational manner. But I advise that before getting into it with anybody, or that it pays to see a lawyer. It initially, even if it's just for guidance on how to handle the situation, because every situation is different. There are different personalities, different dynamics going on, and it really helps to bounce it off of somebody who has some experience in those areas.
And
So, Sam, should you take your lawyer with you when you go to Human Resources?
Well,
or?
that would be an interesting, I'd like to sit in on that meeting. Look, what you need to understand is that the human resource person is not there to help you. The human resources person is there to make sure the company, it doesn't get sued, and if it does, it wins. So lots of times people will call me and say that exact thing. Well, the human resources people should be on my side. Forget that, that's not the case. But do you need to complain to them? Yeah, I think you kind of do. Understand the way these cases are proved, in addition to what we've been talking about, is you need to look at the reason. So you need to know, Mr. Human Resources person, I'm paid $10,000 a year less than my colleagues in this job. Why is that? Because oftentimes these cases, because they're so subtle, can be proven by showing that the reason they're offering just isn't true. In employment law, we always call it a pretext. That's just a fancy word for a lie. But if the reason they're giving is not true, and demonstratively so, you can kind of bet that the real reason is something that's illegal. Don't be naive. I mean, I think you need to talk to HR, but understand that you're going into a den of wolves. Should you bring an attorney in with you? I wouldn't do it the first time.
Okay.
That changes the dynamic. You want them to be forthcoming with the reason. Even if they're going to lie, at least you have then something to attack if you're going to have to do that.
Many workers know that President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act more than 50 years ago. What does that cover, and then when does it fall short?
Well, it covers pay. It covers equal pay for jobs that require equal skill, effort, and responsibility, as Ed said. Where it falls short is in the remedies. If I'm paid $10,000 a year more than you are, and you either prevail through negotiation or you prevail through litigation, the remedy that you have is to be placed in the position that I'm in, which means if $10,000 a year, for example. Where it falls short, companies look at that as a cost of doing business. We do it if we get caught. Well, okay, so we make it right. There is no disincentive for a company to necessarily comply with that law, other than it's good business sense, I believe, and it's good moral sense. But legally, that's the only penalty. The Fair Pay Acts that have been introduced in Congress for the last several years seek to change that by adding a damage component, so that you can seek compensation if that's what happens. But that's where it falls short right now.
And we'll get to more of that in just a moment. But let me also ask you, do the gender discrimination laws vary from state to state, or what should a woman know about that depending on where she lives?
Yes, they vary from state to state, but the federal law is uniform. So, and that's one of the first things we look to is federal law. But every state has its own law, and it's one of the reasons why it's important to contact a lawyer early on in the process, so that you can know what all your rights are, not just the federal rights. Sometimes state law can be an even better, give you better leverage with your employer.
What about the statute of limitations, depending on when this happens?
The statute of limitations is a big problem in employment law often. They're very short generally. Well, the whole Lilly Ledbetter litigation that went on earlier in the last decade was all about statutes of limitations. That's what the Lilly Ledbetter case was about, because she was not paid 10 years ago, but just learned about it a year earlier. All of those 10 years were time barred. The statute of limitations for a Title VII, that is a gender discrimination case, is 180 to 300 days under that law. Under the equal pay law, there's no statute of limitations per se, but you can go back 2 or 3 years from when you file the complaint. So if you've left your job, the statute of limitations is going to be 2 years before you can recover. After that, you won't be able to recover anything.
So timing is very
You
important.
have to act quickly in these cases.
All right, that's just the beginning of our conversation. Remember, our social media team is standing by to take your questions. But up first, how does a woman know if she's being underpaid if employers forbid you from talking about salaries in the workplace? That question brings us to another very important factor when it comes to gender pay discrimination. It is the issue of wage secrecy.
One of the reasons for that persistent wage gap is wage secrecy policy. Wage secrecy is an illegal, unfair labor practice whereby an employer either prohibits or actively discourages employees from discussing their salary. If you just don't know what the other people in your workplace are making, how are you supposed to do anything about it? There's a lot of online resources. You can go to websites like payscale.com, salary.com, monster.com. So do a little online research first, but really the best way to know whether you're getting paid what the guy sitting next to you is getting paid is to ask the guy sitting next to you. If you are retaliated against by your employer for discussing wages in the workplace, call the local office of the National Labor Relations Board and look into filing a complaint. If you work for a federal contractor, call the Department of Labor. It is still a subject that women are not talking about. They're feeling the impact in their pocketbook, but wage secrecy is a very effective strategy at keeping women from earning equal pay. Everybody who cares about women's equality and just every woman who cares about putting food on the table for their family needs to get behind those laws.
Gentlemen, let's talk about wage secrecy. We know that those policies are illegal, and yet, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, nearly half of all workers nationally reported that they were either contractually forbidden or strongly discouraged from discussing pay with their colleagues. If this secrecy is illegal, how can so many companies continue to make it part of the workplace policies? Why don't we start with you, Sam?
Well, I mean, the way they do it because people aren't aware of what the National Labor Relations Act applies to. Lots and lots and lots of people think that National Labor Relations Law applies to unionized activities, which it does, but it applies to more. It protects what's called concerted activity, and concerted activity is discussing wages, for example, with your coworkers. We want to discuss wages because we might want to go to our employer together and ask for higher wages, and that's a violation to preclude someone from engaging in concerted activity. But lots of people, and I dare say lots of lawyers that don't specialize in this area, don't realize that, and I think that's why this works. The double-edged sword that secrecy provides, we talked before the break about statutes of limitations. Again, the Lilly Ledbetter situation would not have happened had she been able to talk with her coworkers and not be dissuaded from doing that. Because by doing that and then waiting a couple of years, a worker may not have a claim anymore.
Let's get to one of our social media questions.
Lindsay submitted this question on our YouTube channel. What do the experts on your program say is the most common type of gender discrimination complaint they see when women come to them considering a lawsuit?
Good question, guys. What do you see most often?
Well, I have to say that what I see is a lot of dismissals, terminations, and generally I see that, and also lack of promotion. Those are the two things that I see the most.
I see the lack of promotions and also dismissals involving what I call family responsibility issues. That is pregnancy, sick children, sick parents, and the ramifications of taking that kind of leave. And that really come up. And I see quite a few Equal Pay Act claims as well.
We have another social media question. We'll get to you in just a moment, but let's shift this conversation for just a moment. We're talking about gender discrimination in the workplace, but are there some additional concerns for women of color?
Well, everything we're saying about women, period, is going to apply probably twice as much for women of color. I think what happens in the workplace with women, and especially with women of color, is there's stereotypes that exist, and it exists because there's rarity. Just take the quintessential thing of a woman working in a coal mine back, well, even probably now. That woman is singled out because there's very few of her there, and so she's made to conform to what the majority thinks is the way she ought to act. And when she doesn't act that way, all kinds of nasty things happen, sometimes from coworkers, oftentimes from management. Add to that a woman of color, there are stereotypes that get associated with that because of the rarity. There's a really interesting number of studies that were done by a social scientist called Susan Fiske, who played a prominent role in the big case in this area, Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins. And what she found is that when you are in a minority, so to speak, in the workplace, or a rarity in the workplace, and you don't conform to the stereotype that the majority sees of that rarity, you tend not to be hired. So in the Price Waterhouse case, Ann Hopkins, who was the plaintiff there, was denied a partnership at Price Waterhouse because she didn't fit the stereotype of a woman. They told her to wear more makeup, dress more femininely, stuff like that. Why'd that happen? Because she didn't comply with how the majority saw her as being the stereotype of women. That's a big issue.
That is a huge issue and certainly a big factor. Let's get to our social media question.
One of the questions we've received ask, I have never contacted a lawyer before and it's intimidating to do so. What should I expect when contacting a lawyer?
Good question, Ed. You're a lawyer. It can be intimidating to contact a lawyer, especially when you're dealing with a matter so sensitive as gender discrimination. What would your advice be?
Well, I think I'd start by saying that you really, if you're looking for a lawyer in an employment discrimination area, you really should look for somebody who has experience in that area, rather than going to a general law firm or a law firm that may specialize in another area of litigation or advice. And that's because lawyers who do a lot of employment discrimination work have been sensitized by what they've seen, by the people they've talked to, and they have an idea of what you're up against. So, I think that's one of the most important thing. After that, I think what's important is being ready to ask questions, in terms of fee, in terms of case evaluation, and also understand that there's a confidentiality relationship between you and the lawyer. And so it's really incumbent on you, and you're protected to talk about all the issues that you see without reservation.
I see. So you want to have a good rapport with your lawyer. Let me get you to weigh in on that, Sam, because it is intimidating. Most people don't deal with lawyers on a daily basis.
Yeah, and you're talking about the essence of who you are when you're talking about work. I mean, you ask, that's such an important part of who we all are, is what we do. So it is intimidating. I think what you need to understand when you come to a lawyer, and especially an employment lawyer, this is going to be like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and you're going to be talking about things that make no sense maybe at the time, but they might be that little piece of that jigsaw puzzle that puts together a picture that shows that you either have been legally wronged or that maybe you haven't been. I think when you're coming to an employment lawyer, you need to understand that you may not have anything that you can do anything about at times. But, the laws in this country are not necessarily geared toward helping employees. I mean, they are in some regards, but there's a lot of things. And we talked about how are the laws different in states. In every state except, I think it's Wyoming, but it might be Montana, you can be fired at will, which means I don't like the shade of dress you're wearing today, you're fired. And as simple as that. So what you want to find in a lawyer is someone that's going to be creative, and you need to work with him or her to get that stories. We ask tons of questions. The old laugh when you go to a doctor and they sit there and take a 2-hour history. They don't do that anymore. Well, we do that sometimes.
Right.
Because some little piece of evidence can really make a difference in these cases.
And we're going to get to what sorts of evidence are helpful in these sorts of cases. Let's take another social media question.
This question comes from Lizette through Facebook. At my current job, I watched a male I trained get a management position over me, despite the fact that we have the same qualifications and I had seniority. What strategies could I use at my next job to prevent me from hitting the glass ceiling again like I did at my current position?
Great question, thank you. The glass ceiling. This is a woman who's qualified. She trained this person and now he has been promoted over her. What's your advice for her?
Well, we see this all the time. This isn't an unusual situation, unfortunately. Many people don't believe that the glass ceiling era is over. It's not. And what to do about it is a real question. You know, my advice is that you have to confront it one way or another. You know, confront it. You can start confronting it at the time you interview for your job by letting it be known that you're interested in promotion, and you can't be shy about your wish or desire to be promoted. And I think that's that's one of the first steps. But oftentimes you're going to get to a situation, even though you take all the right steps, have done everything correctly, taken precautions, where it happens, and then you have to make a decision whether you're going to confront it in terms of going to a lawyer, or whether you think for one reason or another that it would be better for you to move on to another position.
Sam, do you see cases where the glass ceiling exists?
All the time. And it's because, again, you know, we talked earlier about stereotypes. It's because of that same thing. Lots of people have this view that, well, women for some reason aren't serious. They're going to get pregnant. They're going to take leave. They're going to move when their husband leaves, etc. Those stereotypes, while they're not overt, and this is 2015, they're not overt, but they're there, and so they're hard to fight. It's hard to call out your boss on something like that.
All right.
You have to play guerrilla warfare a little bit.
All right, Sam, thanks so much. Well, we are going to continue our conversation about women's rights in the workplace, including legal advice for women who experience discrimination due to pregnancy or who are victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. But up first, in the fall of 2014, we kicked off this Closing the Gap campaign with a special one-hour talk show hosted by Sharon Epperson, and it featured an exclusive interview with a woman whose name has become synonymous with gender pay discrimination, Lily Ledbetter. And right now, we are very happy to bring you this special encore presentation of her interview.
We're joined now by a woman whose name is synonymous with the fight for fair pay. Welcome, Lily Ledbetter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking you what you think about your personal story has really struck such a chord and reinvigorated the conversation about fair pay in this country.
My story struck a chord with almost every household around the nation, actually around the world, because my story is just the tip of the iceberg, and that's how I became the poster child for equal pay, because it was just so drastic that it touched every life across the country.
Well, let's just give a little bit of background here about your personal story. In 1979, you started at Goodyear Tire. You were there for 20 years. In 1998, you found a slip of paper in your mail. It said something. What did it say?
It had my pay versus the 3 white men who had the exact same job, just a different shift. Exact, identical job. And they were I was making 40% less than any one of them. And the first thing that popped in my mind was my overtime pay, how much money I had been shortchanged that I had legally earned and was entitled to under the law. The next thing I thought about was my retirement. It's based on what I'm earning. My 401k was 10%, matched by 6% stock. And today, my Social Security all depended on what I earned.
And when you calculated the numbers, and you talk about it in your book, it was over $250,000. You eventually won a landmark case, a $3 million case, but then that was overturned by an appellate court. You went all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court decides to uphold the appellate case. Why do you continue to fight? Again, you were so close to retirement at that stage right there in 1998. You could have stopped there. You could have stopped so many places along the way, and you kept fighting. Why?
Because once that verdict came down from the Supreme Court, it was no longer about Lily Ledbetter. It was about my daughter, my granddaughter, and all of the families across this great nation. And I hear the stories day after day of how shortchanged families are. And today, women that are seniors, they're living 10 years on average after their spouses, and they most of the time have to move in their children's home because they cannot stay independent.
Well, you went through the halls of Congress in telling your story, and obviously a lot of people were paying attention. How many of them were men?
A lot of them. A lot of them were, and they understood. They really did. They backed me 100%. And you know what was so gratifying about the Lily Ledbetter bill? It was sponsored and co-sponsored by both parties, Republicans as well as Democrats.
And then, of course, it was a man who was the person who made that Lily Ledbetter Fair Pay Act his first act. President Obama did that in 2009. And yet, still, every week you're on a plane. Every week you're fighting the same fight. When will Lily Ledbetter have to stop fighting?
As long as my health holds out, I will be out fighting for equal pay and talking to colleges, because young people today, when they start out, they need to make very sure that they're interviewing and being hired by a company that will pay them fairly and equitably, because they can't make it up. It's usually a percentage. So they need to start out with what they're entitled to.
Who is joining you in this fight today? What men are joining you in this fight today? And are some of the young men on the college campuses that you're going to really rallying behind you as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. They talk about their mothers. I hear story after story related about their mothers being the one who trains all the men who come into the company. And she's faster and better than the men, but yet they are making twice as much as she is. Plus, a lot of times they lay those women off and they don't get to retire.
There is so much more to do, but what do you see as chief among the causes that need to really happen right now to make this fight no longer for Lily Ledbetter or for women? What needs to take place?
We need more companies to step up and to treat people equitably on their jobs, and we need more bills and laws in Congress. Paycheck fairness is not passed any time that it's been voted on, and it's up to the Congress to get these laws passed to give women and the minorities the tools that they can use in order to get what they're entitled to.
Lily Ledbetter, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Once again, that interview with Lily Ledbetter was an excerpt from the one-hour talk show Closing the Gap, 50 Years Seeking Equal Pay. It is the anchor of our ongoing campaign to educate people about the gender pay gap and help women build the skills to close it. Look for Closing the Gap, 50 Years Seeking Equal Pay on your local public television station. Right now, we will continue our conversation about women's legal rights in the workplace, and we'll start with some questions that have come in through social media. We'll do that in just a moment. But first, guys, let's continue our discussion about evidence. You're saying if a woman wants to bring forward a case, evidence is key in whether she can proceed with this.
Sure, evidence is everything. You've got to know why the employer is asserting that it's doing what you believe to be discriminatory. So why are you paying less than the man? Why have you not been promoted? Why are you being discharged? Why are you not being hired? Why aren't you being given leave when you've requested it? This is 2015, as I said. It is a rare situation where an employer is going to say, "Oh, well, it's because you're a woman, or because of your race," or so. So the way we prove these cases is to show that the reason that the employer gives is not true, is unworthy of belief. Because when you're charged with violation of federal law, and all these are, and you aren't straight with the reason, you can bet that the real reason is discrimination. That's what we tell juries all the time. That's what the courts tell juries all the time. So the evidence we need is evidence that what they're saying just isn't true. And then we need to paint a mosaic. We need to show what that workplace looks like. That's what I was talked about the jigsaw puzzle before. we need, discrimination is proved both horizontally and vertically. I always like to, did I do that right? Yes, I always like to say. You need to look at both what has happened to you, but also what's happened to other people like you in the workplace, because that's often a good indication of what is going on there. The corporate culture matters in these cases.
All right, thanks a lot. Let's get to another social media question.
This question is from Facebook and it was submitted by Brittany. Why do hardworking women who decide to expand their family by having a child have to fear for their jobs, but men who expand their family keep their job and are more than likely to get a promotion?
Great question, thank you. Ed, what are some of the discrimination risks if a woman gets pregnant?
Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of risks, and they start out with often termination. The employer isn't going to say that I'm terminating you because you're pregnant, but employers will find a reason, or they'll make up a reason in order to terminate employees who are pregnant. And it goes beyond that. It goes to women who are off for pregnancy leave, coming back, and instead of getting their same job or an equivalent job, are given lesser jobs, or are basically forced out of the company by all sorts of different methods. Perhaps promotions are delayed or not given, and it can be a real problem. And again, this is one of the reasons why women might want to see a lawyer in a situation like that.
And Sam, is there anything that the woman can do? First of all, is she even obligated to announce her pregnancy to her employer? And also, is there anything that she can do prior to maybe her maternity leave to sort of secure her current role and position?
Well, I mean, obviously she's not obligated, but I think you want to. I mean, first off, there's going to come a time when you're not going to be able to hide it. I mean, just as a practical matter. But beyond that, you don't want to be in a situation where you're pregnant, the employer learns about it somehow and takes an adverse action and then argues, well, I didn't know she was pregnant because she never told me, because that puts you in the worst legal position you can be in this situation. You are, look, you're allowed to be pregnant. Right. You're allowed to work at the same time. In fact, there are protections that are there. There's the Pregnancy Discrimination Law, the Family Medical Leave Act, and also the Americans with Disabilities Act that protects both you and your newly born child. If your newly born child is sick, you're protected because of your affiliation with that child. So you need, I'm a big proponent of full disclosure to employers. If you don't want to be in a situation where they say, I don't know. So that's problem one. It's a practical matter, they're going to learn anyway. Second, there are, regardless of the size of employer, while you may not be entitled to a Family Medical Leave Act if it's a smaller employer, you are still entitled to be treated the same way as other temporary disabilities are. So if, for example, if I give a man off 6 weeks if he breaks his ankle, I have to give you off 6 weeks if you're pregnant. So these laws work in tandem.
Okay.
And you should always let people know.
All right.
But you don't have to.
Okay, not obligated, but good to let them know. Let's get to another social media question.
Lucy submitted this question through Facebook. If a pregnant woman must take her maternity leave before the baby is born due to pregnancy complications, how can she request more time off when the baby is actually born so she can be with her child during the first weeks of life without being reprimanded?
And I think, Sam, you were just alluding to that there are protections for the mom and the newly born baby.
Sure. If it's a larger employer under the Family Medical Leave Act, you're entitled to 12 weeks per rolling calendar year. So if you need 6 weeks before, you're entitled to 6 weeks after for recovery. Both you, by the way, and the baby's father, your spouse or someone, is allowed to take paternity leave. So it works both ways. The other issue, if you're a smaller employer and you need additional time, again, my suggestion for that, and I've litigated a couple of these cases where there wasn't, the employer wasn't large enough to be covered under the Family Medical Leave Act, is you have to look at that horizontal thing that I said. Are other people in the workplace given accommodations for things like this? And oftentimes they are, and oftentimes those are the guys. And so if that happens, they have to give equal treatment. So that's probably the best way to attack that situation.
And let's bring you back in. Sam mentioned time off for the mom, the baby, to care for the baby and also the baby's father. Does this apply to same-sex couples?
Well, it does not, unfortunately. The Family Medical Leave Act does not apply for situations where you're taking care of another of your same-sex partner. However, it certainly, if you have a child, it would apply to you, and if you adopt or any of the other categories, it's that one problem area is taking care of your same-sex partner.
Okay, let's get to another social media question.
This question comes from Ty via Facebook. If the Family and Medical Leave Act covers pregnancy leave, why would a woman have to fear her job would be lost or changed if she took pregnancy leave?
Well, and not to make light at all, but there's laws against murder, and people get murdered, unfortunately. And that's, companies cheat, companies push the limit. Some of it has nothing to do with whether they like or don't like pregnant people. It has a lot to do with inconvenience. Bosses don't like to be inconvenienced sometimes, and I think sometimes, we can talk on a larger level about not liking women with pregnancy, but sometimes it's as simple as that. Companies cheat, so that's why you sometimes need to worry about that. That's why these laws were passed. They're passed to eventually change behavior, but in the meantime, they're passed to give employers an incentive not to violate them, because if they do and they're caught, there are some pretty substantial penalties.
Okay, let's take another question from social media.
This question was received via Twitter. How can we prove unconscious bias in the workplace?
Proving unconscious bias. Ed, why don't you weigh in on this?
Well, that's
tough to prove?
Well, it's tough to prove in a way, but in another way, it doesn't really matter that whether the bias is unconscious or not. What matters is the effect. And if what you're doing, or if what the company is doing, is having a discriminatory effect, in other words, if women are being paid less than men, and it's due to some kind of unconscious bias, then it's actionable. It doesn't matter that the bias was unconscionable. The big problem with unconscious bias is it's so hard to change in the workplace, and it's in a way, I mean, it's incumbent upon employers, and it's really in their best interest to work at this, because they're being subjected to liability not only for their actions, but for their supervisors' actions, and even coworkers' actions in, for instance, the case of sexual harassment.
All right, and we're going to get to that. Great question, guys. Thank you. Coming up, we'll tell you what to do if you are the victim of sexual harassment in the workplace, and we'll talk about your legal rights if an employer retaliates against you when you speak up about gender discrimination. But coming up first, as part of our Closing the Gap campaign, we are inviting people to share their questions and comments about the gender wage gap by uploading videos on our website. Here's how to upload your video and then look for your comment or question in an upcoming Closing the Gap webcast special.
We want to hear what you have to say about closing the gender pay gap.
My name is Amber and I'm from Bronx, New York.
I'm Stephanie from Ohio.
I'm Maggie and I'm from Pittsburgh.
From California.
I'm from Pennsylvania.
And I'm from Chicago.
Visit our website and upload a video with your questions.
My name is Lee, I live in Virginia, and my question to you all is, why do you think that the pay gap is still such an issue in 2015?
How should we better go about enforcing the idea that women should be paid equally to men?
Do you find that you have to ask for raises, and have you experienced repercussions for doing so?
Tell us lessons you learned the hard way.
I should have stood up for myself. Do not be afraid to ask for your review, and do not be afraid to ask for your raise.
Offer your words of advice.
wage gap hits African American and Latina women hardest. To all my sisters of color out there, I have a message for you. Never stop doing and never stop trying.
If I ever had a wife and a daughter, I would want them to be paid fairly. I wouldn't want them to be taken advantage of at all.
And tell us what you're doing to help close the gender pay gap in your own life.
I want you to take those negative statistics and let them fuel you to be great.
Visit www.womenwagegap.org and upload your video today. Together, we can speed up the process of closing the gap. We appreciate your questions, and right now we're going to answer one of them.
My name is Lee, I live in Virginia, and my question to you all is, why do you think that the pay gap is still such an issue in 2015?
Some people think the wage gap is entirely about gender discrimination, and discrimination is part of the problem, but it's not the only factor. The wage gap is caused by a complex set of factors, causing women to earn less money overall in their lifetimes than men earn. Here's the whole story. Women make up half the workforce, and 6 out of every 10 American families rely on women's paychecks to make ends meet.
My daughter, she's a breadwinner. She works hard for her money.
Right now, my wife makes more than me.
Yet, U.S. Census Bureau statistics show there is no industry in America where women earn more than men.
For most women, they are in the workplace because they need to be working and they need the economic security.
Deborah Brake specializes in employment discrimination law and gender law, and she testified twice in Congress in support of fair pay legislation. It's a highly politicized and hotly debated topic.
Democrats want you to believe that Republicans do not support women.
So far, Republicans in Congress have been gumming up the works.
This statistic is the lightning rod for a lot of the argument.
Today, the average full-time working woman earns just 77 cents for every dollar a man earns.
It's a statistic that's easy to misinterpret and to manipulate. The big question that gets buried in the politicized fray is this: why? Why is the wage gap even wider for women of color? Why do so many women work in low-paying service jobs? Why do women with college degrees tend to pursue lower-paying occupations than men? Why do they tend to have shorter work histories than men? And why do women experience more career interruptions to care for family members? The answers reveal many gaps in many areas, and women feel the collective effect in their paychecks.
I think, first of all, the 77 cents on the dollar is an important number because it's a benchmark across time compared to men. That becomes probably a soundbite that every reporter can grab and every story can focus on. After that, though, it's a lot more complicated.
Sabina Dietrich conducts research on economic and community development, and she studied the range of factors that contribute to the wage gap.
We looked at gender wage gaps by age groups, by industries, by occupations across metropolitan areas in the country, and found that the places that had the best wages were the faster growing metropolitan areas. Civil service matters. Unions matter. State legislation can matter if you've got living wage legislation. Those are all parts of the reason for the wage gap persisting.
I think of it more as lost opportunity. For doing the amount of work that you're doing, you're not going to be bringing home as much as you should be for them.
If we're going to value the work that people do, I mean, a lot of us are underpaid as it is.
What does the wage gap mean for the financial security of America's families and for the economic security of the country as a whole?
Families absolutely need women's income, which makes it an issue of family security as much as a women's issue.
It's a women's issue, it's a country's issue, it's a civil issue, it's an equality issue.
So the gender pay gap is caused by many factors that lead to lost wages over a lifetime. And today we're talking about women's legal rights in the workplace to fight the gender discrimination that affects her pay and job security. I want to remind you that there is still time to send us your questions through social media. We will get to those in just a moment. But guys, first let's talk about sexual harassment, because certainly a woman's pay and job security are at risk if she is experiencing that. Now, from a legal standpoint, how do you define sexual harassment in the workplace?
Well, legally it's defined as unwelcome or unwanted comments or or touching or actions of a sexual nature that are offensive to that person and would be offensive to a reasonable person and creates an abusive or hostile work environment that the employer knows about. I like to define it, it's sort of, you know, when you were on the playground when you were young and the bullies always attacked you where you were most vulnerable. Well, now just fast forward 30 years and those bullies are now in charge of the workplace. It's the same thing. They attack you where you're most vulnerable.
Let's get to a social media question.
We had 2 similar questions submitted on Facebook from Matt and from Trevor. I have worked in an office with a large amount of women before, and the jokes and the banter can at times have a very sexual or racy tone. How should I address this with my coworkers? I'm never sure what is considered crossing the line since females and males are making these kinds of jokes.
Ed, how does one determine when the line has been crossed, they maybe feel uncomfortable and are experiencing sexual harassment?
Well, I think the line is crossed when the atmosphere that's created and the sexual harassment basically permeates the atmosphere. I mean, the legal term I think it's pervasive, and at that point the atmosphere becomes hostile. It makes it very difficult for one to work, and that's basically it's the essence of sexual harassment, and the line is already crossed. And at that point, you know, it's time to complain. It's time to take action.
What if it's coming from just one person at your job?
So long as it's more than trivial, I would say, it's gone beyond what you should have to endure. And at that point, it's actually a good time to make your complaint to HR or to your supervisor or to the person who's doing it. It's really essential that you make clear to the person who's doing it that it's unwelcome, because if matters go on and this ends up being a case in court, you don't have a case unless it's clear that the activity that you're complaining about was unwelcome and you made that clear.
Okay, let's take another question from social media.
This question comes from David on Twitter. What steps will be needed to increase the number of women in leadership and government roles? And do you think that shift would help to advance equal pay laws?
Why don't you start, Sam?
Yeah, I think that shift would definitely help. I think, unfortunately, you know, attitudes take time to change, and I think it's a slow process. Having said that, you know, it's been 50 years since the Equal Pay Act was law, and we're still in that situation. But I think it's evolutionary. I think it will. I know my daughter is paid nicely now, more so than she would have when I was growing up. But it's still not enough. I think it's going to have to take time. And I think when we have more people in authority, when that glass ceiling starts lowering a bit, is when we're going to start seeing everything else work.
Let's close with our conversation talking about the issue of retaliation. A woman addresses the issue, she makes a complaint, she feels that she's being discriminated against. As a result, her employer retaliates against her. What form does that retaliation take? What is that like, Ed?
Oh, it ranges from everything from being fired on the spot. Usually what happens is the employer comes up with some reason, creates a reason for firing. You know, all of a sudden good evaluations become a bad evaluation, despite no history of bad evaluations. Promotions are, you don't get that promotion that you were going to get. And even what I've seen a lot is almost social isolation in the workplace, which is often encouraged by the employer. So it can be real, and it can take the form of something that causes an economic detriment, like loss of pay from being terminated, to things that are much more difficult to categorize because of the social situation.
Sam, I want to get your take on this, and I also want you to bring into the conversation asking for wages. If a woman asks for a raise, could that be retaliation if her employer feels she isn't deserving or doesn't want to give it to her?
Well, I mean, it can be. Anytime you assert any right under any of these laws, there's a subject of retaliation, but there's also some protection. The kind of interesting catch-22 that social science research has looked at in women who ask for more, I've had cases where employers have said, well, the guy negotiated to brinkmanship, he wouldn't have come and worked with us unless we paid him more. You didn't do that, ergo we didn't pay you as much, and that's their legitimate, they claim, reason for not paying a woman. There's some studies that have been done by Professor Linda Babcock at Carnegie Mellon University that found that when women negotiate more, they tend not to be hired, as opposed to men who, when they negotiate, they tend to be. It's a kind of an awful catch-22 that it puts you in. You need to ask, and you need to be able to negotiate, oftentimes, to get more pay. But there's this nagging belief, and it's supported by some fairly valid social science research, that women who don't do that, or women who do that, are viewed less favorably. And it comes back to what we talked about earlier with the Price Waterhouse situation. Women are stereotyped as not being aggressively negotiators for their own benefit. And when they start acting like the male would, then they're looked on less favorably. We took a case and did that, attacked that issue, and the court held that it wasn't a factor other than sex to use negotiation.
Let me ask you this. If a woman wins her case, what does she gain from that?
Well, there's large things and small things that you gain from that. I mean, initially for yourself, you gain what you've lost, whatever that is. If you've lost your job, you gain either your job or the financial equivalent of your job. In a larger sense, I think you contribute to that slowly moving evolution that's going on. The reason Congress passed these laws, in a lot of respects, was to help people get what they deserve, but also to teach. I always talk about lawsuits as being sort of like smacking a dog on the behind when it goes on the paper. Companies need to learn lessons, and they learn lessons by having to pay damages or to be ordered by a court to make things right. So there's two kind of levels that you gain by becoming involved in asserting your rights.
And Ed, the one thing is that a woman shouldn't be afraid to complain and use it to make her interests known about what she wants in a position if she feels she's being discriminated against.
That's correct. I mean, if nothing is going to change if people don't come forward. And one of the things that I see often with potential clients and clients who come in are people who had complaints and did not complain for long periods of time. And as we discussed earlier, there are short statutes of limitations on these cases, and people lose things. They lose whole portions of their career by not confronting things at an early enough stage.
Okay. Final thoughts on this, Sam?
Yeah, it takes courage. I mean, that's why Lily Ledbetter was a very courageous woman, and lots of other people, small and large, are very courageous all the time. It takes courage to assert your rights, but we won't move forward until that happens.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. We certainly appreciate your comments, and we appreciate the information from social media as well. And of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope that this Closing the Gap special presentation has helped you understand your legal rights so that you can fight gender discrimination in the workplace. We would love to hear your feedback about today's program, and certainly we invite you to take a brief survey online at womenwagegap.org/survey. We also hope that you will continue the conversation about closing the gender pay gap. Talk about it at work and social media, in your community, and with your representatives in government. Together, we can speed up the process of closing the gap.
Closing the Gap, 50 Years Seeking Equal Pay is made possible by the Eden Hall Foundation seeks to improve the quality of life in Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania. Through the lens of women's issues, it continues the stewardship of Sebastian Mueller in the areas of human services, health, education, and the arts. And by Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania has empowered women for 145 years, advancing women's causes with their Centers for Women in Politics, Entrepreneurship, and the new Chatham University Women's Institute opening in 2015. And these additional donors: Kathy Raphael, Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney, PC, Georgia Berner, MSA, and the Women and Girls Foundation.